everyone. My name is Janelle Williamson. I am the Administrative Coordinator here at the Crane Center. Welcome to our October Crane Research Forum, our second online research forum of the year. We are so excited to have you all as our guests, and even more thrilled to have our speaker today, Dr. Casey Boyd-Swan, joining us virtually from Kent State. So we are going to be sending our housekeeping items about the webinar via the chat. I did want to let you guys know that Dr. Boyd-Swan welcomes questions throughout the presentation, and I will be monitoring the question and answer feature to interject any questions that might come up throughout the presentation. And we'll also have some time for questions at the end. But now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, again, Dr. Casey Boyd-Swan. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Kent State University. Her research primarily focuses on the intersection of early childhood education and employment decisions. She previously published work examining the effects of parental non-standard hour employment and childcare decisions and how that impacts children's cognitive development and mental well-being. Most recently, her work has focused on understanding childcare provider hiring preferences and how these preferences are influenced by state-level policy and participation in quality credentialing programs. So today, Dr. Boyd-Swan is with us to present her research on hiring childcare teachers. What do providers want, and what external factors influence preferences? Thank you so much. I will now mute myself, turn off my video, and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I am so glad to be here. Pardon me while I get my slides back in order. So thanks everyone for coming today. It's really just such a pleasure to be able to talk with all of you, even though I can't see you. I know that you're out there, in internet land. So as Janelle indicated, my name is Casey Boyd-Swan and I'm faculty at Kent State University. I received my PhD in public administration policy from Arizona State University. And my research really focuses on this intersection of early education and different policies and programs that are relevant to that. I have previous work that examines parents' use of evening and overnight childcare, as she said, and this is related to outcomes for children in particular I'm interested in. Currently, I'm working on a project that explores facets of state policy which may create barriers to childcare providers' success and longevity. But today, what I'm going to be talking about is hiring in center-based childcare settings. So I get this question a lot, which is, why are you studying childcare? With, of course, inevitably people ask, oh, is it because you have a child? And while certainly that probably doesn't hurt the fact, that's not really why I study childcare. I study childcare because it's important in so many different in so many different dimensions. First, it's really important for children's development. There's a great deal of research, right, that's focusing on the importance of high quality early care and education, especially as it pertains to improving children's school readiness, their development, and also their emotional well-being. But childcare is also really important for families. And I think it's probably really driven home the point that we've had recent shutdowns in childcare availability for folks that this is an important facet and resource for parents, especially mothers, and their ability to be able to work. So that's kind of the second layer of why I study childcare. And lastly, providers and teachers really have long realized that they have to juggle these two potentially even competing interests, where they want to provide an environment where children can develop the skills that they need, while also operating a business that can continue to serve as a support for parents. Policymakers are catching up to this and have come to recognize the importance of childcare and are increasingly intervening in this domain with stated goals of improving access, affordability, and quality. So given that, what is it that we know about childcare and kind of explicitly center-based childcare? Well, we know that classroom quality is important to children's development and that the quality of the workforce, specifically thinking about teacher credentials, is cited as being associated with both classroom quality and also child outcomes. Policymakers have used this research to guide state and federal level policies that are intended to improve center-based childcare. For instance, states now have basic minimum standards that staff must meet for providers to be in compliance with licensure regulations. But despite the importance of that, and the increasing presence of state regulations intended to improve quality, quality still tends to be low. Previous work suggests that providers might actually face some constraints where they need to balance a desire to offer high quality care with a need to keep costs low. And so these competing goals may be further complicated by state regulations for minimum teacher requirements. Next, there's mounting empirical evidence that minority children in particular benefit when they're matched with teachers from the same racial or ethnic background as they are. Although the literature mostly focuses on the K-12 setting, evidence that race matching generates short-run improvements in test scores, attendance and suspensions, teacher evaluations of student performance and expectations, but also in student academic attitudes is increasingly common. About half of all children ages 0 to 4 are non-white, and we know that children who are Black and preschool aged are slightly more likely to participate in center-based childcare than their white counterparts. Yet the non-white share of early education workforce continues to lag behind that of the children that are enrolled in these programs. So given this, we might expect that we would see an achievement gap between minority and non-minority children, specifically preschoolers. And in fact, there's some recent research that does find that. And then lastly, policies and programs that are created to regulate center-based childcare and to generally improve the overall quality of care aren't universally found to improve this quality of care. And this could be for a variety of reasons. For example, research that examines the impacts of the quality rating and improvement system has very mixed results, with some reporting positive outcomes, some reporting null or negative outcomes. But part of the problem could be that state QRS are designed and implemented differently from state to state. It's also feasible that there is confusion on the part of providers about how to best navigate their state's program, and some confusion on the part of parents about how to distinguish between quality levels when they're selecting a childcare provider. There's a lot of things we don't know, but there are 3 things that we don't know, questions that we have in particular that I'm going to talk about today. And I'd like to go through those very quickly. So the first is, research and theory suggests, right, that certain teacher qualifications are important, but do providers agree with what research and theory suggests? Just a quick preview, yes and no is the answer here. Do providers only focus on quality related attributes of teachers when they're hiring? Again, not always. For the most part, yes, but not always. And we'll kind of dig into that a little bit later. And lastly, do policies and programs currently in place influence who providers want to hire? The answer is yes. But interestingly enough, sometimes this occurs in really unexpected ways. So we're going to go over those towards the end of this presentation.
We do have a question, Casey. So Matt Brock says, interesting, the regulations are so variable in how they promote quality. Do you think Ohio's regulations are well designed?
That's kind of a loaded question. I don't think that the QRAS in general are poorly designed. I think that they have some facets through which they could be improved. And I'm going to talk about that actually later on in the discussion. So maybe if we can come back to that question towards the end, then I can give you, I think, a more complete explanation of how I think the QRAS system in general could be improved. So until then, I would like to hear from you guys. So you're going to have a poll that pops up for you. And really what I want to know is, if we were in a childcare center and we were looking to hire a new teacher, what is it that we would look for from that teacher? You can pick, I think, up to 3 options. So kind of maximize what it is you think is the most important out of these options. We have education, and this can be any kind of facet of education, experience, relevant training and skills, being a good worker, indicating that they were a good student, and maybe there's some sort of personality type that we think would be indicative of a good teacher. Okay, so while you guys are responding to that poll, we're going to leave it open, but I'm going to continue to talk. And while you guys are responding to that, I'd like to give a little bit more background about what it is I'm going to be talking about today. So in order to answer these three questions that I just posed to you, my colleague and I performed what's called a resume audit study. And this is a really fancy term, but essentially it's just 4 steps that you're doing. And what it takes is the following. 1, you make some fake resumes. Made about 11,000 of these, and these resumes were of fictitious applicants that were going to be applying to some assistant or lead teacher position in a center-based childcare setting. These fake resumes were then sent to providers that had posted real job openings. Okay, and there were over 2,700 of these that the fake resumes were submitted to. And it took us about 9 months. So 4 resumes were sent to each job opening that we found, and just called for each month, tried to find up to 150 job openings, and then sent these fake resumes to these providers and recorded then which of the resumes with varying characteristics were asked to come in for an interview. And the reason why we do this is that the majority of the questions we have necessitate coming at this issue from the perspective of a provider. We know a lot about if something happens in a childcare setting in a classroom that may be associated with a positive or negative outcome for a child. But what we don't understand is we've set out in research that there are good or desirable characteristics of a teacher, but we're not really quite sure what providers think about that. And there wasn't really anything out there that took it from a provider's perspective to say, well, what is it that you look for when you're hiring somebody? Certainly we could have gone to providers and asked them, but that would have taken a long time. We definitely wouldn't have been able to hit 2,700 providers. So using this resume audit study approach, we were able to go to a lot of different providers and find out from them what it is that they see as a teacher that's important for them to be thinking of as someone that they would hire. And so we did it using this. We've got our poll results here. So experience and relevant training and skills really hit home. But also personality, education are pretty high, with good worker and good student being a little bit lower on the list. So that's very interesting. Let's see how your perspectives and your opinions stack up to the providers that we had. So first of all, I'm just going to show you a brief view of the map of where we were. We were in 17 states and 14 large US cities: San Diego, LA, San Francisco, Seattle up in Washington, Phoenix, Arizona. In Texas, we were in Dallas and Houston, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Chicago, Illinois. We were in Atlanta, Georgia, DC, which, because we had a 25-mile radius where we would apply to jobs from the city center, that also bled out a bit into Virginia and Maryland. We were in Philadelphia, New York City, and of course, Boston. So now let's take a look at one of the resumes that is a sample resume that would have been sent out to a provider that posted a job opening. And you can see it's nothing fancy. We actually went to the internet and located about a little over 75,000 resumes of actual people looking for employment as a childcare teacher. And we used some of the characteristics and language and just the layout from those to build our own fictitious resumes. Everything that you see on here is randomly assigned onto each resume so that it could replicate really an experimental setting. So first, let's take a look at one of the sections of the resume. This is the name and contact information. We used 15 different names on our resumes. 5 of them were white sounding, 5 of them were Black sounding, and 5 of them were Hispanic sounding. And how that operated was that we looked at census data and also New York City Health Department birth records to look at the most prevalent name in each of these race or ethnic categories, and then combined the first and last names together to have 5 names within each of these race and ethnic categories. Every name got their own unique email, and that email was the contact information that the providers could respond to ask for an interview. The names didn't vary across cities, but the addresses did. So if it was in Chicago, this would have had a Chicago address, physical address. Next, we included this introduction statement. This was very common on the resumes that we looked at of real childcare applicants. And you can see this statement: I'm an enthusiastic and energetic person, right, who seeks employment working with children. So this statement was pretty universal across all of the resumes. It varied in one aspect, and that was these 2 adjectives that are included: enthusiastic and energetic. And this reflected the personality of the person. So we used the Big 5 personality assessment, which includes 5 different personality types: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. We eliminated neuroticism for, well, obvious reasons. We're thinking probably nobody in childcare wants to hire somebody that is indicating neuroticism. So that was left out. And the other 4 were included with these 2 adjectives that varied across each one. Next is employment. And every resume had 3 employment events, starting at the same year and ending in the present time. For a third of the resumes, they had no previous employment experience in childcare setting. For a third of the resumes, they had experience, but only for 6 months. And then a third of them had experience, but for 2 years. And we did it this way so that we could try to understand what experience and the length of time of previous experience, what kind of difference that made in providers' interest in an applicant. Next, we looked at education. So every single resume that we sent out had a high school education. They had completed their high school degree. For a third of the resumes, that's all they had, though. They had just a high school degree and nothing else reported. For a third of them, they had an associate's degree in addition to a high school degree. And then for the next third, they had a bachelor's degree in addition to the high school degree. For this, if they were an associate's degree, then it was a community college that they were assigned. If it was a bachelor's degree, then there was a university that they were assigned. Some of them were in-state, some of them were out of state. We also included GPA, so the applicant's GPA ranging from, it was 2.8, 3.3, or 3.8, and this was supposed to signal how good of a student this person was. And the GPA was always attached to the highest level of education that the person had. For other skills, every single person had certifications in CPR and first aid, and also a fingerprint clearance card. This is minimum requirements, so we made sure that everybody had that. A fourth of the resumes had only that. The next fourth had CPR, first aid, fingerprint clearance, and a CDA credential. The third fourths had this cultural diversity and early childhood programs training, and also fluency in English and Spanish. And then the last group had CPR, first aid, and fingerprint clearance card. And then they indicated that they were employee of the month at their most recent employment, and that they had received a bonus for this. So if their most recent employment was in a childcare setting, then that meant that they were employee of the month at that childcare setting. Oops. I'm sorry, one more. We also have this additional information. I have access to reliable transportation. About half of the resumes received this statement and half of them didn't. Okay. So let's kind of shuffle back to the 3 questions that we're interested in answering today. Research and theory suggests certain teacher qualifications are important. Do providers agree? So we saw what you guys said. What is it that providers wanted? What did we find? And I'll draw your attention to the bottom here. If it's in this kind of light yellowish orange color, then there was slight preference on the part of providers for this. If it's in this more, deeply orange color, there's moderate preference for this. If it's in this kind of orange red color, there's a really strong preference from providers for this characteristic. So when we look at education, compared to those that had only the high school degree, we see that there's a pretty moderate preference on the part of providers to hire those that have either an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. But that there's no really distinguishing preference between those two things. So they're pretty equally drawn to those that have any sort of higher level of education. It didn't really matter if it was associates or bachelors. In terms of major, there was, again, a pretty moderate preference for both nursing and business degrees, but a really strong preference for early childhood education degrees. And I think this is probably what we would have expected to see. When we break it down by education and major, then we see that for those that have an associate's degree, again, a really strong preference for ECE, a moderate preference for business, and a slight preference for nursing. But for those with a bachelor's degree, suddenly there's a moderate preference for nursing, a slight preference for business, and a really strong preference, once again, for an ECE degree. For experience, and this was, I think, really a shock to us, but it seems like not what you guys would have voted on either. And that was that relative to no experience, there's this really strong preference for 6 months of experience, where they're really drawn to those that have 6 months. But when it comes to 2 years, all of a sudden it decreases. It's moderate, is actually borderline in the way that I cut it, slight preference. So there's a much stronger preference for those with a shorter amount of experience than a longer amount of experience. For GPA, 3.3 had slight preference on the part of providers, but they didn't have any sort of, they didn't distinguish between those that had a 2.8 and a 3.8. There wasn't a preference for really high levels of GPA. For skills, there's a moderate preference for those that had the CDA credential, but a really strong preference for this diversity and fluency kind of skill set that was displayed earlier. And still a slight preference for folks that had indicated that they were employee of the month. So that's kind of signaling that good worker, right, mentality. And interestingly enough, and completely in disagreement with what you guys voted on, our providers did not distinguish at all between extrovert, agreeableness, conscientiousness, or being open to new experiences. They were all equally preferred. So moving on to the second question. Do providers only focus on quality-related attributes of teachers when they are hiring them? And these are the non-quality characteristics that we're going to take a look at here. So in terms of college, and again, this isn't really indicative of one's quality, because all of the universities that we indicated were at about the same quality level. Some of them were located in state, some of them were located out of state. And providers didn't see this as indicative of a teacher that was more or less preferred by them. We also looked at experience setting. So if you think back to the resume, that individual had their experience at KinderCare. When we built this, we kind of thought of 3 levels of, I'll say quality, but that's not really how it was cut. It was more cut about how expensive it was and what kinds of curriculum and services they're supposed to be providing. So YMCA was in what we'll label the low quality bin. Child time and KinderCare are labeled in this kind of medium quality bin, and Goddard and Primrose were considered, we thought, maybe a higher quality bin. Providers didn't see it that way. Previous experience at all of these settings was all pretty equally preferred. So where they had their previous work experience didn't really matter. When it comes to transportation, and you'll recall that there was the sentence at the bottom, I have access to reliable transportation. Having that on there and or not didn't make a difference. Providers weren't explicitly drawn more to those that had that statement on there. Interestingly enough, is there a question from the audience, Janelle?
Yeah, there are a couple. I was going to let you finish this slide. I turned my video on a little early, so.
Okay, I can finish this up real quick and then take a pause. So I kind of figured I was going to get some questions here. We'll see what they are. When it comes to race and ethnicity, however, all of a sudden we see this really moderate to strong preference for applicants whose names were in this white sounding category relative to those that are black sounding, and still even a small preference for applicants that have a Hispanic sounding name relative to those with a black sounding name. So it does appear that there is some racial and ethnic discrimination in hiring preferences. And I'm going to leave it right there so that Janelle can ask the questions that are in the chat window.
Great. Okay. So one of the questions is, did what providers want vary at all across the cities?
So we controlled for where the city was, the city itself, but also if it was in a specific region. We weren't sure if there would be a greater or lesser preference for applicants with a Hispanic sounding name or Spanish fluency if they were located in the Southwest. That it didn't seem to matter. So what I'm showing here is extracting from all of that the geographic location of where the provider is.
Great. Another question is, can you explain the lack of interest that providers had towards experience?
So I have some theories on that, and I'm really interested actually to hear what folks in the audience have to say about that, because my theories are just my theories. It occurs to me that it might be the case that providers, and let me put a little asterisk next to this. When I was doing my dissertation work on evening and overnight care, I had no idea what to ask. I had no idea what to look at because I had never worked in a child care center. So I actually called up child care centers that were open late hours, and I asked them, can I come? Can I visit? And they let me. So I spent 6 months in and out of different childcare centers, just going overnight so I could talk to people, talk to the director, talk to the staff, observe what happened at night. I had no idea. So it may be that a provider has a different perspective than I do. And I'm sure that they have information that I don't, but I suspect what's happening is that providers have unique ways of either structuring their classrooms or offering their curriculum that they feel are probably better than other providers around them. And if you have somebody that has 6 months of experience, it's good because they have some experience, but maybe they aren't stuck in their ways. Maybe the folks that have 2 years of experience are kind of stuck in how they do something and may not be as flexible to meet your expectations of whatever it is that you want your teachers to do. So that's my guess.
We had a thought from the chat books. They would have to chat box, not books, sorry. They would have to pay a staff with more experience, more money as a theory.
So, right, and that could be the other, is that if you have more experience, then you maybe want more money, and less experience is less expensive. And I think that is a nice explanation because it goes along with this kind of competing demands on the part of providers, which is, I want to provide quality education, but I have to stay in business and I want to keep my costs low. So to do that, this might be a good way of meeting that. Yeah.
I'm going to throw back to you. We have a number of questions. I'm not sure if you want to keep moving on and get more towards the end, or if you're ready for questions.
So let's move on, and maybe I'll answer some of these questions and maybe I won't, but if not, we can go to the Q&A and hopefully answer them at that time. Okay.
Great.
Okay. So in terms of the race and ethnicity, I'm going to unpack it a little bit more, because as we were submitting these resumes, we also collected a whole bunch of information about the jobs that we were applying for, the positions themselves. And one of the pieces of information that we collected was what the position was that they were hiring for. Was it assistant teacher? Was it lead teacher? If it was lead teacher, was it for an infant toddler classroom or was it for preschool age classroom? So I'm going to break it down by that. If we look at assistant teachers, we see that there's this really strong preference for applicants with white sounding names still over applicants with black sounding names, and a small preference, still a slight preference for those with Hispanic sounding names. For lead teachers, however, it decreases again, right? So there's this moderate preference for white sounding names versus black, and a small preference still for Hispanic. When we break the lead teachers out by the age of the child, we see still a moderate preference for white sounding names relative to black. No difference for Hispanics, for Hispanic sounding names at this point. But when we look at preschool classrooms, all of a sudden it explodes again in this really strong, I mean, stronger than in any of the other categories, preference for those with white sounding names relative to those with black sounding names. And again, this small, slight preference for Hispanic sounding name applicants comes up again. And that brings us to the third question, which is, do policies and programs currently in place influence who providers really want to hire? Just briefly, I'm going to be talking about basic minimum state licensure requirements, which are often based on position, where experience is part of the equation most of the time. It could be none, or it could be 2 years based on position. For education, it could be none or BA based on position. We also create an index of the stringency of state requirements, and this includes things outside of teacher experience in education, such as staff to child ratio, maximum group sizes, and also program director experience in education requirements. Thinking through the impact of state QRIS, which, as I said, varies by state, both by whether participation is voluntary or required, but also these quality rating levels, where the structure and the standards within each level is very dramatically different from state to state. But across the states, it's all the same, which is the goal is to improve the quality of care available, right? And then finally, we're also going to look at the National Association for the Education of Young Children's accreditation program. So NACCE has this national program where it's the same regardless of what state the provider is located in. And we're interested in how accreditation through NACCE is influencing how providers might see who they want to hire. So in doing so, we find the following. First of all, when an applicant's experience meets that state's experience requirements, providers aren't necessarily compelled by that. But when they meet education requirements, there's a really moderate preference for that applicant. However, when they meet both experience and education, there's this really strong preference for that applicant. In states that have stringent state regulations, the more stringent the regulation, so for states that have the most stringent regulation, all of a sudden we see these racial and ethnic preferences kind of disappear and actually move in the opposite direction, where providers that are in these states actually show a slight preference for applicants with black sounding names and Hispanic sounding names. So there's no longer this racial and ethnic gap in preferences. Thinking about just state QRIS participation, this isn't any quality rating level. This is just if they participate or not, if the provider participates or not. Providers that participate don't meaningfully differ in their preferences from providers that don't participate when it comes to ECE experience. They do have a slight preference for ECE education relative to non-participating providers, but again, it's really slight. They, however, have a pretty moderate preference for an applicant holding a CDA credential, although none of the other skills came up as important. Now, for providers that are accredited through NACCE, this is where things become really interesting. There's this very strong response on the part of these providers where they have a really moderate preference for ECE experience, a strong preference for ECE education, a slight preference for holding a CDA credential, but again, a moderate preference for these other skills like the cultural and diversity training and English-Spanish fluency, and also employee of the month. For state QRIS participants, that are in the highest quality tier, they actually start to look a lot more like the providers that are accredited through NACE, where they have a slight ECE preference, experience preference, again, a strong preference for those with the previous ECE education, and these moderate preferences for both CDA credential and the other skill sets. So there's something about being in this highest quality tier of a state QRIS that has them start to be compelled to look very similar to the providers that are NACE accredited. So just going to bullet point some of the takeaways here for these questions, right? Do providers agree? Well, providers do show preferences for previous experience in education, and they prefer relevant education, right? We can see this in that the ECE education is really important to them, not just any education. The ECE has a really strong preference. But interestingly, they don't prefer more of either. So to the question of the individual in the chat window, right, 6 months is actually more desirable than 2 years. And between an associate's and bachelor's degree, there really isn't a strong preference between those. Providers kind of see these as equally desirable. Providers, unfortunately, do appear to have some racial and ethnic discrimination when they're showing hiring preferences. And this discrimination seems to be especially pronounced when they're hiring lead teachers in preschool classrooms. We have some theories about what drives this, but I haven't gone into those here, but I'm happy to discuss them in the Q&A later. And then finally, the policies and programs and how these influence providers. Providers do tend to prefer applicants, right, that meet these minimum state experience and education requirements, especially when they meet both of them together. Providers, though, that are in states with no requirements actually prefer more qualified applicants than providers that are in states where their requirements are the least rigorous. So if states are setting their standards too low, it actually has the effect of kind of pushing down the quality of the individual that providers are looking to hire. I'm using the word quality as defined by the characteristics I'm looking at here. We also know, though, that the more stringent regulations seem to be eliminating this discriminatory preference that was shown in the second question. QRIS participation, we can see it's not enough. Just participating, regardless of level, doesn't do anything to shift preferences upwards. But NACE participation and high QRS rankings do seem to have this really large, strong impact on provider preferences and willingness to hire based on different characteristics. So my takeaways are that providers do care about teacher characteristics that we believe matter, but they also display some racial and ethnic discrimination in hiring preferences. Providers do respond to state regulations by altering their hiring preferences. In one way, that's not great, because if state regulations are set very low, that this may actually unintentionally decrease the quality of classroom education. But if state regulations are really rigorous, it not only has the effect on quality that we would hope it would have, we suspect, but it also mitigates discrimination in hiring preferences. So there is an indication here that setting state regulations to be more rigorous has unintended consequences that are also particularly good for minority children. State QRIS participation, again, alone, it doesn't shift hiring preferences really much at all, but especially not to the extent that we would hope for. And it may be that because states are allowed to build their own QRIS, they have these different levels of quality tiers that they have. They have different pathways to get to different levels of quality tiers. So there's just a lot of variation in the structure of these programs. And it's designed that way to be very, very flexible so that providers can kind of choose their own pathways to different quality rating levels. It may be that this flexibility that's afforded by this structure might actually discourage providers from making workforce investments that NACE accredited providers are really compelled to make in order to keep their accreditation status. So those are my takeaways, but I'm really interested in hearing from all of you. How should we think about these findings? What factors might explain hiring preferences of providers? What did we not consider? What are some explanations for some of the things that seem just a little bit confusing, such as why would they prefer 6 months to 2 years, which I think that we have some pretty good answers to already. But I'd love to hear more about what you guys have to say about this.
Great. So with these questions, you can use the chat box to respond, and we'll read through some of the questions, or sorry, some of your responses to these questions.
Yeah. In general, Q&A, I'm also happy with now too, so.
Great. So we can go ahead and start Q&A while people are getting their thoughts together, sending out thoughts. I'll kind of go back and forth between questions and chat box. So let's go back to that first.
Okay.
Again, it says, interesting, the regulations are so variable in how they promote quality. Do you think Ohio's regulations are well designed?
So I don't think that they're poorly designed. I think that if what our goal is to improve the quality of so QRIS, I would say has two kind of competing goals. One, they want to provide they want to improve the quality of providers overall. And one of the ways that you can do that is that you can hint to providers, hey, these are the things that you do, right, to improve the quality of childcare provided in your center, in your classroom. The other pathway and the other mechanism is that it starts to educate parents about what it is that they should look for in a provider that matches kind of this higher quality tier. And part of the problem with the way that state QRIS are designed is that it's not really clear what level distinctions mean, right? So if you've ever looked at some of the pathways that providers can follow to try to increase their quality rating level, some of them are points based, and they have to earn so many points in order to move on to the next quality level. Some of them have to meet certain standard requirements, and then other hosts of features. But largely, providers can kind of, it's like a grab bag, pick and choose what it is that they want to focus on to move to the next quality tier rating. And some of these choices are more or less expensive. And the truth is that employing higher quality teachers that have more credentials is going to be more expensive. So if a provider really has their eye on cost control, then engaging in and investing in these workforce factors is maybe not going to be what they pursue. So I don't think that Ohio's QRIS is poorly designed, but I think that there are ways that it could be improved to try to actually nudge providers and parents to more fully understand what building a child care provider that offers high quality early care and education really takes and really looks like.
Yeah, we've been getting a lot of comments and more questions about this, the idea of pay and cost of quality and experience.
Yeah.
Some of the comments about your questions, there's a lot of them, so I'm trying to get through them. Yes, so cost of the teacher is the reason. I would assume they do not want more experience. Experience with only 6 months of, because with only 6 months of experience, the provider has a greater ability to help teach and train based on the organization's philosophy and expectations, which you mentioned in your presentation.
Yeah. That idea was prompted to me by one of the providers that I stayed overnight in quite a bit. And I spoke to her. We hadn't begun this project yet, but I was interested in how she hired, because I thought, gosh, it's really got to be hard, because you're expecting people to work overnight, right? They have to stay awake while the kids sleep. And one of the things she said was that it's really easier to get somebody in that hasn't worked at a whole lot of other places before, because you can train them to do the things the way you want to do them instead of the way that they're just always been accustomed to doing them. So that I stole that idea just from thinking this through with a different provider that was helpful for me.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of other providers, again, in this conversation are mentioning similar things.
Yeah.
We have another question related to pay. It says, some of this I think you just answered, but I'll reread it again just in case. So I'm wondering how this interacts with pay. So the associate's bachelor's in difference, is that relative to the hourly amount they may pay teachers so that associates may save the program money? I'm also wondering about the overall pay differences in NACE and higher rated programs versus non-QRS participants or lower rated programs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know that anybody has looked at that. I'll be honest, there is not a lot of research out there on NACE, period. Which is surprising for an accreditation program that's been around as long as they have. Very few researchers have looked at it, but it definitely could be the case that because they're hiring more credentialed teachers, that they do pay them more. Now, there is a gap in pay that is really more along the lines of race and ethnicity, where childcare workers that are white get paid about $15 an hour, relative to childcare workers that are Black get paid significantly less, closer to the 13 mark. So it wouldn't surprise me that there are some gaps in pay based on education, experience, the accreditation of the provider. That wouldn't surprise me to find that at all.
Great. And the person who asked that, Sarah Lang, she also made a comment to look at Marcy Whitebook's information on pay, differences by education level. So
yeah, I'll take a look. Whitebook has been a source of information for a lot of the work that I do. I don't recall if she talks about that. She probably does, but I'll take a look. Thanks.
Another question we have here is, how is early childhood education experience different from a CDA? They are both education. Was there a difference?
So surprisingly, and we tried different combinations of this where we looked at, was there a preference for folks that had an AA with a CDA as opposed to an AA just of ECE, or a BA with a CDA as opposed to just a BA? And we didn't find that to be the case. It was kind of, once they had some sort of higher degree in ECE, it capped out there. So adding the CDA on top of it didn't do much more in terms of provider preferences to hire. But just the CDA alone, in lieu of associate's or bachelor's degree, did have a moderate preference among providers.
That's helpful. Going back to some of your questions to the audience, how should we think about these findings? What factors might explain these preferences? Some providers have mentioned that teachers with bachelor degrees leave for better paying jobs more frequently, and they can have more asks about benefits and things like that, which some smaller providers are not able to provide at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I suspect that's what keeps providers from showing a strong preference for folks that have a bachelor's degree, especially if it's not in ECE. If you look at the NSECE survey data, where they surveyed the workforce to find out what it is that the childcare workforce largely, what do they look like? What are their characteristics? There were a surprising percentage of teachers that have a degree that's not that's not even education related. Of those, nursing and business were the two largest groups. And I suspect that if their bachelor's is in one of the non-education related fields, I could see a provider saying that person's just looking at this as a stopover. They're maybe not going to stay. And maybe their thinking is that they'll stay a little bit longer if they're ECE, but maybe this is also just a place to earn some more experience before they move on to some place that's higher paying. I fully agree with that. So I don't think the education results were as difficult to understand as the experience results. It makes sense to me that providers are trying to, again, balance this cost versus quality, where they have to stay in business, right? They can't go out there and say, I'm just going to charge parents $200 more a month. because frankly, you can't open up a newspaper without finding an article about parents saying, well, childcare is so expensive. Sure, but that's because you're trying to provide quality care. And so I think that it can be really frustrating on the part of providers to try to juggle these two things. But frankly, that is what they have to do.
Mm. So now we have a question here about more of the study design. So the question is, I'm curious to know whether the study designers responded back to centers who emailed for an interview. If so,
Mhm.
what did you tell them? Did you tell them that the resume was fake?
So as part of the internal review board, we actually had to get it approved that we were going to do this research because it is deception in a way. Um, we told them that we weren't going to respond to any inquiries for an interview. And we did this because we didn't want to waste additional time on the part of providers. We figured that for each application that they looked at, it would take between 5 to 7 minutes to look at it. So grand total, it would be about, 20 to 24 minutes of time, or 28 minutes of time that they would spend. And we didn't want to waste more time with engaging in them. A few providers would email again, but by and large, when we didn't respond the first time, that was the last of the communication we had. Um, we also did a follow-up survey with the providers, which they didn't know was related to this. So none of the providers that were in this study actually know that they were in a study, unless they can connect that they were looking for a job opening with the follow-up survey that they took. But we did do a follow-up survey to find out from them what the distribution of the kids that they served was, what the kind of demographic features of the kids are, of the staff. Even ask them, did you hire somebody for this position? And if so, what were their characteristics? Who did you ultimately end up hiring for this
Mm.
position? So if they connected those, then they would know that they were in this, but otherwise they don't.
Yeah. Very interesting. You spoke with Crane scientists on this survey design in the winter, and it is fascinating to me. So going back to the questions, we have a question from Laura. It says, what could a workforce development council provide to support teachers in employment?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that's a really good question. I think that they could help them focus on things that providers are going to find most important when they look at a resume. So things like the statement, unimportant. It really didn't matter to employers that that was on there. And interestingly enough, of the resumes, the 75,000 resumes that we found online, I would say the plurality of them had that statement, but it was meaningless. It didn't really alter preferences on the part of providers. So I would say you can kind of not focus on that. We thought that it would be important that they hinted that they have access to transportation. And we thought that because real resumes had that. And I can see why it might be important because the provider would say, well, this person's extra reliable, right? It didn't matter to them at all. They weren't interested in that. Really, what they focused on were kind of the things that we thought might be important, which was education, experience, and some skills. But there was also this kind of undercurrent of that there are identifications that might happen. There's a signaling of race and ethnicity that might hold them back. And that's, by the way, not unique to the childcare labor market. That's been found in every labor market that's been studied. So I would say that if applicants were going through a workforce program, that they should focus on the things that we might think them make them more qualified, the tangible things that might make them more qualified, rather than these kind of intangible things, and that there are also some things that are out of their control.
Yeah, another question here is, what is the percentage of providers who are NACCE accredited? And have you considered examining Head Start programs with their stringent program standards?
So we explicitly went out of our way not to apply to Head Start programs. Part of the reason why is that they have slightly different standards of what they're looking for, but also their application process looks different. You'll notice we didn't apply to any big chains, and that was largely because the way that they run their application process is all funneled through centralized human resources. So anything that did it that way, we weren't interested in applying to. It was really, these are smaller providers. I think it would be very interesting to look at Head Start to see what their hiring preferences were. Didn't do it, but maybe, once this is all done, we'll take another look and see if we can go through another round. If anybody will respond now. I mean, we actually didn't get caught, which I think was surprising. We definitely thought we're going to get caught. There definitely somebody's going to say you're not real, but we didn't get caught. So maybe we can do it again.
Yeah. All the Head Start providers listening are going to know.
Shh, don't tell anyone.
We did have a comment actually from Julie. It says, as a Head Start program, we show a preference for associates or bachelors in ECE because it's required for a preschool lead, and a CDA isn't enough for a lead, but is a requirement for an aide or assistant under Head Start.
Yeah, I mean, given that, I think that one of the things we would definitely find in Head Start is that you don't have this racial and ethnic discrimination happening, because they are so focused on who it is that they need to hire, that there are explicit standards that they have to meet to. And I suspect that that's some of the reason for the elimination of discrimination in the states with really stringent standards, and also for those the providers that are NACE accredited, is that providers are so tuned in on the characteristics that they have to have in order to meet standards that they really can't make decisions based on anything but that. Because providers don't get a huge pool of applicants every time they send out a job opening. They get maybe 12 applicants for every opening. Okay, let's say it's a really, high supply area. Maybe they get 20. They don't get a lot of applicants. So when they get very few applicants and they have specific standards they have to meet, the folks that are in these places are really tuned in on what the characteristics are of the teachers that they have to hire, and kind of let everything else go by the wayside.
We have another comment from an early Head Start person that is associated with our center that says, yes, let's study early Head Start programs. So you have some advocates there.
Okay, but you guys have to promise to keep this quiet then. Because if everybody knows.
Exactly. And we have about 3 more minutes, so we'll see what we can get through. There's a couple of questions related to your findings with the preferences with ethnicity. So one is, can you explain why providers would desire diversity in their classrooms but prefer white sounding names?
Yeah, that was really interesting, right? So yes, I think we do actually have an explanation for that. A lot of what kind of influenced the racial and ethnic discrimination was kind of centered in 2 places. The first was the actual race and ethnicity of the program director themselves. There was just very strong preference for applicants that matched the race and ethnicity of the program director, and not just for directors that were white, also for directors that were Black or Hispanic. That if there was a race match, that was, I mean, we're talking just enormous preferences based on racial match between applicant and provider director. A second thing that we can kind of look at is the share of children that are diverse, right, within a provider. So as I said, we did the surveys. We tried to find out what was the ethnicity of the children, what's the distribution of the children that are attending each care center. And we found that in centers that had a larger share of white children, for instance, there's again this just enormously strong preference for white teachers, or for teachers that have applicants that have white sounding names. But the same wasn't present for programs based on the share of Black students. It didn't kind of shift in a way that we might think. There was kind of just no a preference for a different between preferences based on race and ethnicity. In the share of Hispanic, there was a smaller preference for Hispanic sounding name applicants, but not to the degree that the share of white children was. So it seems like it could be a case of that it's actually consumer driven, where providers either know or suspect that the parents of children are more comfortable with a teacher that meets, right, the racial or ethnic identity of the children in that center.
All right, well, that ended right at 1 p.m., your last sentence. So I apologize for the questions we aren't able to get to at the moment. Thank you all for such engaged participation in our event today. Again, when you click leave meeting, you'll be directed to a survey. So please fill that out, give us some feedback, and we will also be sending the recording and the slides out to you all in the next couple of weeks. So thank you all for attending.
And you're all welcome to send me questions at my email information here. I'm happy to answer them. And it was such a special time to get to present this all to you all. Thank you.
Yep, thanks everyone.